First off, my name is heathnaylor. I'm a developer at By the Pixel. You can find us at bythepixel.com. And currently we are hiring for a front-end developer, junior and up. So if you're interested, go to bythepixel.com and check us out. We'd love to talk to you. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into TMUX. And it's considered a terminal multiplexer. So kind of a core concept to understand is what is multiplexing in terms of the terminal. So at the top here, this black icon you've got is your terminal. That's your bash session open in iTerm or whatever tool you use. And then you have these various connections from TMUX that sort of pipe their output into that terminal. And so those are called TMUX panes, and we'll get more into the terminology a little later. And those pipe into the bash terminal. So that's a high-level overview. We'll look at this a little later as well to give you a reference back to it. So let's talk about support. And this is going to be operating system support. This is one of my big reasons for why I think you guys should use TMUX. You've got WSL, the Windows Subsystem Linux, that they introduced last year or the year before. So you can technically use TMUX on Windows as long as you're using WSL. You've got all the BSD flavors, OpenBSD, FreeBSD, NetBSD. You've got Solaris, OS X, and of course Linux. So the theme underlining all of this is a Unix environment can compile and run TMUX, and it works pretty much flawlessly across all of them. So the one caveat there is, of course, Windows Subsystem Linux. If you have to develop on Linux or on Windows, you can still use this. It's kind of a Unix system, you kind of know it, but it comes with quirks. So just know that as you're approaching that and getting into that, that there's going to be some hardships and bumps along that road. If you can do it, just code in a native Unix environment, and everything will work better. All right, so let's talk TMUX alternatives. So already at this conference and a couple of the other talks and talks from last year, you'll see people splitting their panes using iTerm, or maybe they're using Screen or some other tools. Maybe they're using Terminator for Linux. This one isn't as portable. It's still a good tool, but it has a dated feel and look for me, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And then there's Screen. And Screen is a pretty popular tool that's used primarily on servers when you're looking to attach to them and you've got a long-running process in the background, and you want to be able to leave that SSH session, come back to it, and see that your script's still running. TMUX pretty much out of the box offers everything that Screen does, with some conveniences of configuration being easier, and it's also very portable, very easy to set up. And it's what I've learned on and used for the last several years. So TMUX is definitely the closest competitor to Screen. If you know Screen currently, it's still an excellent tool. It might be worth it for you to check out TMUX anyway and decide for yourself which one you like. Okay, so one of the cool things about TMUX is its extensibility. It's got a plugin system, and it's also got a full API, so you can wrap it in your own application and extend it in that way, which a few of them have done. I'm not sure how to pronounce this. It's a Japanese word, I believe, biobu, maybe. Somebody can correct me on that if they want. It's a wrapper around TMUX or Screen. It's either one, which is pretty cool. And it gives you additional features and conveniences that you would maybe expect out of the box. It's sort of an opinionated way of doing things. And then a really cool one I like is WeMux, which is an enhancement to TMUX that has 3 modes. So it has a mirror mode that gives clients connecting to the same session the ability to have read-only access, in other words, view your terminal session, but they can't interact with it. They've got pair mode, which is basically the client and you share a cursor and can navigate around the same session over SSH and interact that way. And then they have something called rogue mode that allows the client to pair with the work that you're doing, and they can control an independent cursor within the same session. So you can kind of pair code or like triage a production problem that way if you wanted to do it. So my big call to action is going to be you can do it and you should do it. Go download TMUX. You'll know how to do it after this talk and fit your workflow into it. Get to know the keyboard shortcuts and see, is this a tool that I want to use? You won't know until you try. It's going to be a little painful at first because it's a lot of commands that you have to remember on the keyboard. But once you have those and you build those over time, you become more of a power user. So first we're going to look at some terminal anti-patterns. These are opinionated. These are sort of things that I've seen over the years working with developers or other people and sort of seeing how they use their terminals. If you do your terminals this way, don't feel bad. It's fine. But maybe look into a TMUX or tool like it, even iTerm with panes, and fix what you're doing. So without further ado, let's look at some of the anti-patterns. You've got the traditional Cygwin and PowerShell on Windows just stacked on top of each other. You don't really know what's where. Maybe terminals don't really have a purpose. You're just CDing through directories to get whatever you want. Maybe you only have PowerShell because you've got administrative access to it. It's a pretty dirty flow that you see pretty commonly. And then to evolve upon that, you have the transparent stacked windows with colors everywhere. And so you can start to see that it gets to be pretty ugly. I don't have great eyes, so when I'm working with developers, I'm just like, can you move everything else out of the way so I can see what I'm looking at? And then there's just more evolutions of that. It's just the same thing, stacks upon stacks. You've got that Ubuntu purple for the terminal, and then you slap a layer of transparency over it. Not an efficient use of your desktop space. And then this is eTerm. And so he's got 5 or so terminal windows open, and then he's got a drilled down context menu 3 layers deep. I just think that's funny. It's just a lot going on there. Who knows? I think there's Vim back there somewhere. And then another one is just transparency with colors. Like perfect example on this screen. I can't read any of what those blue things are. I have no clue. So when I'm leaning over trying to triage something with someone, I'm like, can you highlight it so I can see it? So this goes into accessibility. So people think of accessibility just in terms of like, my UX needs to be accessible, but it's also accessibility for developers. Like maybe your IDE should have fonts that are usable by everyone or configurable in a way, and go straight down to the terminal as well. Have colors that are visible, especially if you work with somebody that's colorblind. Maybe not a bad idea to adopt a pattern for them as well. So this one is wasted space and too busy. I think this is Terminator. And first off, all the pink that you see there at the top is the same for every window. It's just the working directory that you're in, and which really doesn't tell you anything the terminal doesn't already tell you. And then you've got these paddings, these white paddings between all of them that are just taking pixel real estate. And it's these little things, like especially if you're using that many panes, which you probably shouldn't be. It's just taking all your real estate away from you. And so the goal is to sort of start to minimize that. Here's another one with Terminator. And this one's actually better. This is probably the best of the anti-patterns. The only reason I consider it an anti-pattern is, again, that wasted space. You've got the red bar, the gray bar, and then you've got I think it's probably an apt session or something in there, or a directory FTP client. There's just a lot of bars and things floating around, so the less that your terminal is in the way, the more you can see the applications within them. So that's what TMUX really shows benefit as for me. So let's go ahead and introduce ourselves to TMUX. So this is going to be a set of slides that are an example of people using TMUX in various ways. This guy has configured it to where you can just use your mouse, grab the pane divider, and resize your pane that way. TMUX out of the box does this all with keyboard shortcuts, but there's a series of plugins that give you the ability to do these sorts of things that you want to be able to do. So I thought that was a pretty cool one that guy's using. This guy kind of has built an IDE within his terminal. He's got his navigation on the right for all of his files. He's got his terminal down below. He's got Vim, and Vim is the ability to, of course, split windows out as well. And he's able to navigate through Vim and back into TMUX fluidly. And there's plugins out there, Vim plugins, that allow you to use the same Vim shortcuts you're used to, and they just cross-apply to TMUX. So when you go to the right of your furthest Vim pane, you end up in your next TMUX window, which is really convenient. So I thought that was cool that he built that. This guy's building a Ruby application, and he's writing RSpec. So he's able to use Vim to navigate through all his files, do everything he has. And then on the bottom pane that you see there, he's actually running tests in live. So you can see, okay, I'm making my change. Is my test coming from failing to passing? And then he can move on and iterate that way quickly. So he's got a test suite integrated with it, which is really great for TDD. And you can expand these to be whatever you want. This next one, he's got a plugin on the bottom that's just a battery meter. So you can see how much battery you're using and it charges back up. And then he just starts to use TMUX as you would expect. So this is a pretty cool example of what you can do with plugins. Everything there at the bottom. So the status bar comes in 3 sections. You've got the left, center, and right. You can control the widths via the TMUX config and really customize it to be what you want. And you can take any binary that outputs to the terminal and you can just tell it to push into that status bar, and now your own application is running in TMUX. So you can make it as custom to what you want as desired. So, all right, let's dive into the terminology of TMUX. So once you install TMUX, which is very easy to do, it'll start and you'll have a server, a daemon running in the background. And that daemon will be online as long as there is a session. If that session goes away, then the daemon will disappear and you'll have to restart TMUX. The sessions can be started in the background, so you can detach from a session and you'll still have your TMUX server running, and that's the same functionality as Screen, where you can then reconnect to it hours later and look at your script that's executing, make sure that it's still running as expected. Sessions can be stopped. All the data will be lost unless you use a plugin that persists that data to a disk, which there is a really good one that I use. And you can attach and detach from different sessions. So you can have multiple sessions on that server. And if you're, again, I said earlier that there's a whole API external of TMUX. So if you're outside of TMUX, you just use the TMUX command followed by ls to list your sessions. And there's a whole API that you can leverage and you can script around. Like if you want to write a Rails script or a Ruby script or a Go script. So the server has 1 or more sessions. In this example, we have 2. You can rename those sessions to be specific to whatever you want them to be, and then you can search through them and find them that way. Let's go ahead and assume that we've got just the 1 session for now. And then we're going to see the next layer, and you're going to start seeing these encapsulate each other and nest into each other. The window is part of the session. So you can, again, 1 or more windows. If the window goes away, the session goes away. And you can name the windows as well as create them and destroy them. And inside of the window itself, you have a collection of panes. So you can have 1 or more panes. If you destroy the pane, the window goes away. If the window was the last window in the session goes away. If the session was the last on the server, then the server goes away. So it's turtles all the way down. You can create the panes, destroy them. You can split them into more panes. So we've got an example of a 4-pane split here, just evenly spaced. You can resize them if you want, and you can zoom in on them, which is one of the best features of TMUX, I think, because oftentimes, especially with IDEs, you're splitting your windows, but you want to just look at this one full screen, so you have to drag it out of the editor and then make it full screen, unless anybody knows a better way. So in TMUX, it's just, by default, you get that. Coolest of all, to me, is all of these panes can be synchronized. So you can synchronize your cursor across them all and say, clear, enter, and it's all clear. Or you could have, say you want, 8 instances of local script running for some reason. You just create 8 panes, synchronize your panes, run the script, and now you're doing concurrency. So it's pretty cool in that way. And this gets back into the multiplexing. This is what we can think of, like all those panes, those 4 panes you see, are what are outputting into the bash terminal. Side effects of that are if you zoom in 1 terminal window, 1 pane, the whole thing's going to zoom with you. I can't tell you how many times I see, especially at talks, they'll start, oh, I didn't plan my terminal right, the text is too small, and they've got 4 panes open. They have to go to each individual one and zoom in on it so you can see them. So it's a convenience factor just to have it all tied together. All right, so let's assume that we're zoomed in on 1 pane, and we've got it taking up the whole window. Anyone connecting to the TMUX server is going to be able to operate in this pane out of the box. They can interact with it, they can unzoom it, and you can do that in the same session as everyone else. So you're all sort of in it together. And this is achieved over sockets, Unix sockets. And we'll get into that in a demo here in a little bit. So, for me, plugins are a pretty essential part of TMUX. The top two here are my favorite, Resurrect and Continuum. Continuum is an extension of Resurrect. What Resurrect lets you do is basically save all your sessions, windows, panes. It saves their orders. It saves what directories that you're in. It saves the history of them. It saves your Vim sessions or NeoVim sessions. So you can just restart your computer, resurrect, and dive right back into whatever you were working on in its exact state. And I believe that saving of state can be extended to any application. You just have to write your application to support it. Yeah, it's pretty powerful. So you can have each pane responsible for a certain thing, and so if you're scrolling up through your command list, you'll have the latest command for just that pane, even after a restart, which is pretty great. And then Continuum wraps Resurrect, and on an interval, it'll save your session, and then when you restart your computer, it'll just restore that session, you'll open your terminal, and you'll be dumped right into it. So it's a no friction way to get back to work. Sidebar, 1Password, and Better Mouse Modes are some other ones. The Better Mouse Mode is one that lets you sort of drag those panes around, scroll through windows with your mouse, things that TMUX doesn't do out of the box. 1Password, if you get a Unix password prompt, you can open up the 1Password extension and it'll just pipe that password right into that secure entry form for you. And the sidebar just gives you your directories in your terminal, which can be pretty useful. There's a whole bunch of plugins. At the bottom here, I've included a source. This is sort of the main source I want to reference in general. It's a GitHub repo called Awesome TMUX, and it lists tutorials, plugins, cheat sheets for keyboard shortcuts, which is super important. I would go look at that first, right after you get TMUX installed, and start to understand what you can do with it. Yeah, really good resources, really good community, and actively maintained, which is nice. Okay, so let's talk about some patterns that you can do with TMUX. This is kind of a pattern. It's a mechanical pattern, but you've got a constant state of motion on the left, and on the right you have a staggered state of rotation. It's just kind of neat, isn't it? I like things like that. All right, back on track. So I'm just kind of naming these patterns myself. Make your own is what's going to come down to. The first one's going to be the terminal repository pattern. This is assigning sessions as a group of repositories for a single project. So say you've got a software as a service that you work on, and it's got several repositories across its ecosystem, and you don't know day to day exactly which one you're going to need to be in. So you just assign a window for each one, and when you need to work on that, you just go to that window. And you can organize them like the most common on the left, lower numbers, the least common on the right, stuff like that. And it just gives you a good way to get yourself right back into that environment without having to say, oh, what state do I need to set my terminal up to manipulate this? It's just saved there for you by you. The windows, or the panes, are specific responsibilities for each of those repositories, and we'll sort of show you what that looks like. So, say that you've got your server, you start a session, mine will be for By the Pixel where I work. There could be another project, maybe we have other clients that we work on. You could have any number of those. But say that we have a client app, and this is going to be a front-end application. We'll also have an API, and a database, and a queue. So in the client app, we're going to have our Node web server. Maybe you want to run your Node web server in development mode and just watch the output of that as you're developing. Look for any exceptions, anything that's happening there. Maybe you want your tests over to the side so you can run them or have them constantly running. And you can do your package management up in this window. And those are distinctly what those do. And if you're just worried about tests or another one, say there's a fourth pane called Vim, then you can just zoom in on that and the rest of the concerns fade away until you want to go back out to them. So it presents itself as a pretty useful pattern. I use this pattern daily, and I have for the last year and a half or so. I've slightly tweaked and modified it. Some panes violate the responsibility. I might CD away from the directory just to have two applications side by side. But for the most part, this works really well for me. Another one that I want to talk about could be a server management pattern, where in this case our sessions are different services running on the machine. Say that this is a machine that has a bunch of Docker containers, so they each have their own service. Each window in that case could be, or each session in that case could be a different Docker container. And then windows are different concerns of the service, and panes are a way of accessing those concerns. So say that we have a web server. This could be Nginx or Apache or anything you want, any web server, Unicorn, whatever. Then you've got your config, and I've got an error in this. So in the config is a concern of the web server. We've also got a microservice as another session for us, and then as another window we could have status. So we're concerned about the config of the web server, the status of the web server, and maybe the logs of the web server. So for the config, we can view the web server config. Say maybe you've got a PHP application running. Maybe you have a Node application running as well. And then for some reason you've got Java and Tomcat. Why not? Just all running on the same service. So you can look at all the configs of all of those at one time. And then you can switch over to your status, and maybe that's like your health checks. You can switch over to logs, and you can look at all the logs from the various things and try to determine, where errors are coming from. But the important part for this is to get creative and just make your own stuff. Like, you've got your own problems to solve, and you need to figure out how to solve them. TMUX is just the baseline for getting you there, and those patterns are just a template. You can come up with anything, and I encourage you to. All right. So we're going to walk through a little code, and as anything good in development, we're going to go ahead and start with Docker, just an easy way to get up and running. So I'm going to kind of run through this fairly quickly. This is our Docker file. This is an SSH server that I'm setting up. So I just went on Docker Hub, found one that just had SSH installed for this presentation, and built my image off of that. I run some updates, and I install some dependencies of TMUX. So incurses and libevent, those are the two dependencies that TMUX has. If you're doing nothing else, those will get you up and running with TMUX. I have wget and build essentials to pull down TMUX and compile it. And I've got git for a TMUX plugin manager that I'm going to be using as well. And that's really all you need to get up and running. So we've got a TMUX configuration file. I'm doing some custom configuration of plugins that we'll show you. And I've got an entry point that will just run the SSH server for us. All right, so I set my working directory to root. I go ahead and get TMUX 2.7 from GitHub, and I extract that, and then I configure, make install that to compile it. And it's really as simple as that. You don't have to set any flags. I mean, certainly you could if you want, but out of the box, that'll just work. And then I'm going to install the TMUX plugin manager that allows you to do all of the plugins like Resurrect and Continuum. So that's the same process. I just go to GitHub, I get that tar file, I pull it down, I make some directories for the plugins, I move TPM in there. This is all documented in TPM's GitHub page. I set some execute permissions, and I run an install plugins command from TPM. That's just there for you to, this will be in code on GitHub up after the conference. This is here for your reference to look back on later and just get a template of how to do this. And after that, we just set the entry point, and that's just going to run the application. All right, so let's go ahead and do a demo. For some reason that didn't, see if it plays. Yeah. So this was in Turkey, and it was a failed demo. I hope this one goes better than that. All right. So this is going to get a little weird for me here. Where's my mouse? I found a flaw in holding the microphone. Hang on. There we go. I'm going to turn off pairing real quick. There we go. Okay, so I'll give you an example here real quick. So I'm in TMUX on my local session, and as you can see, it's pretty much impossible to read. So I'm just going to, oh, that didn't work. There we go. Wonder why it's doing that. There we go. All right, so I'm just going to zoom in on my terminal. And as you can see, both panes at the same time are zooming in. So I can get it somewhere comfortable for all of us. Let's see. How's that? Pretty good? And then I'm going to use TMUX to zoom in on just this pane that I'm concerned about. There we go. All right, so inside of here, if I list out my project, you can see the same files I was working on. We've got this Docker Compose file. Let me show you that real quick. So this sets up our services, and it also sets up a network that they can all share. So basically I've got my top one, this is going to be the SSH server, and then I'm going to have two clients that I'm going to use to connect to that SSH server. And we're going to sort of be using TMUX within TMUX, so they have different themes. The one with the blue on the bottom there, that's going to be my local machine. All right. So if I look at my Docker, well, I'm just going to use Docker Compose to connect real quick. I've got to type one-handed. Maybe I can just go up. Okay, so I'm going to use Docker Compose to execute a command that will essentially launch a bash terminal inside of my client. So now I'm inside of the client, and the client is on the same network as SSH. So I can just tell him that I want to go from my client computer, say this would be your local computer, into a computer that's up, like maybe it's an EC2 instance or a Linode instance. So you connect into there. And from here, we can drop into TMUX. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a TMUX ls, and we can see that there is no server running, right? So I'm going to just execute TMUX. And now we can see the green bar at the bottom is the TMUX inside of the SSH server, and I've got a plugin there at the bottom right that I've gotten installed that monitors memory and CPU usage every 2 seconds. All right, so we're in here and say that we want to create a pane below. Oh, looks like I've already got. Oh, whoops! I used the wrong. I used the wrong prefix. So I have two different prefixes for these. So I'm going to create a pane below. There we go. Let's see if this works. And I can zoom in on it. So I can zoom in on that pane. I can zoom out of that pane. We can move up the other pane and we can split it. And say I want to CD into the var directory. Okay, so we've got that state set up on one client. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this guy. Close him. All right, I'm going to open a totally new terminal now. And we're going to sort of side-by-side this, if we can. Yes. Okay. I wonder what happened there. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to CD into my directory. It's not cooperating with this AirPlay. Come on. There we go. Okay. So now I'm in here and I can use Docker Compose to connect again. Okay, so now I'm in the second client server, totally separate from the other one, and I can SSH into my SSH server. Okay, so we're in there, and what I can do from here is I can TMUX list that session, and we can see that we've got one session with one window that was created. So let's go ahead and go over to this other session. We'll create a new window, and we'll name that window DD for Develop Denver, and then we'll TMUX ls again. And we can see now that we have two windows. One is called, I guess I named the pane itself. Anyway, so I'm going to attach to that TMUX session. So I'm going to attach to 0. And now we can see that we're in that same session. So what this has done for us is given us the ability for, I wish the sizing was working better, it's unfortunate. Okay, we've given ourselves the ability to see both of the terminals, and so now inside of here, we can see as I type in real time on the other client, you're seeing the same typing going on. I can move over to the other client, and I can interact equally with that session. So you can use this to peer code or peer triage any problems that are happening in a production server. You can see that I've got these dotted lines. In TMUX, and this is where it differs from screen, the screen with the smallest viewport demands the space. So if I were to zoom out on this guy and make him bigger, you would start to see that port changing until the other port became the smallest. So that's one of the limiting factors of TMUX, but in reality it's not that bad. You're just dealing with the smallest space available between the two clients. So that's pretty much TMUX in a shell. Let me show you the config real quick. So this is the TMUX config that we've got set up. Inside of here is where you can set up any key bindings that you want, and you can just have it run any command line execution with the key binding as well, which ends up being pretty useful. So, for example, we'll look at this line 10. We're just setting the foreground to green, background to black via the API, and then we're literally running a command using this syntax to run this binary on the computer, which is pretty useful. So that's how you can pipe your information directly into TMUX. So that's it for the demo. Do we have any questions? Bueller?
Are there any integrations for working within Visual Studio?
Okay, so integrations for working within Visual Studio. I believe in Visual Studio you can have a terminal instance, right?
Yes.
Okay, how do you do that? Just go to terminal, do terminal? Okay, you're in here. TMUX. There you go. You're in it. I've got some font issues at the bottom, so I'd have to figure that out because I'm using a custom plugin. But yeah, so now I can create new bash sessions. I could detach from these. I can list TMUX ls. I can see that I've got another one running, so I'm going to go ahead and connect to Develop Denver. So I'll do TMUX attach -t Develop Denver. Okay, and I'm in there, and I'm again restricted to the same size as my other session. So if we look back at my session, I can type my command in here. I can go back to Visual Studio, and I can see it in there as well. So direct interaction. TMUX is a multiplexer, so any terminal it can attach to, which is pretty convenient. And I'm just going to go ahead and detach from the internal server, because things are getting a bit weird there, and I'll detach from the Docker container, or from the SSH session, and then from the Docker container. And now I'm back on my root system within Visual Studio. This works for any IDE that allows terminal integration, which is pretty cool. Anything else? All right, I think that's it for me. Thanks, guys.